He's a Harvard-trained scientist, he's a physician, and a serial entrepreneur. Those three things usually do not go together, I can tell you. He has started not one, not two, but $300 million companies. He has also been a competitive martial artist, so make sure you clap at the end of his presentation, and also a professional cellist. Today, he's the founder and president of the Platypus Institute, a research organization that studies the science of peak performance. He counsels athletes, business professionals, and top executives to rewire their brains as well as their bodies so they can play at the top of their game. And he's going to do the same for us. Please welcome, everybody, Dr. David Bach.
2 years ago, my friend Lamar took a martial arts class, and one of the things he learned in that class is a technique that you can use to disarm somebody who's holding a gun. So the technique he learned, it's a very simple one. You just take the person's wrist and you bend it back, and when you do that, they can't hold the gun after. Now, to train himself into this movement pattern, he partnered up with somebody in the class and he practiced it. So he went to his partner and he bent their wrist back. Then he took away a little plastic gun. And then he handed it back. And then he did it over again. So he took the gun away and handed it back. And so all in all, during the course of 20 minutes, he practiced the movement somewhere around, I'd say 200 times. 2 days later, late in the evening in the streets of New York, this is an absolutely true story, he's walking along in the Bronx and a man steps out of the shadows and holds my friend up at gunpoint. So I want to ask you, what do you think Lamar did in that moment when the gun was pointed at him? Just take a guess.
He ran.
He ran. Okay, so some of you are saying he ran, some of you are saying, oh, he actually did what he was trained in, he took the gun away. It's actually a two-part answer. The first part is he did what he was trained. So he bent the wrist back, he took the gun away. It's the second part where the surprise happened. It actually surprised Lamar. That's exactly correct. As soon as he took the gun away, he immediately handed the gun back, and he actually got shot in the foot. Now you might be wondering, well, what on earth was Lamar thinking? But of course he wasn't thinking, right? This all happened way too quickly for his conscious mind to process what was happening. And I think all of you have heard of the neuroscience principle illustrated in the story. It's called neuroplasticity, right? The basic idea is when you practice a new movement or skill, the neurons inside your brain will actually rewire themselves very quickly to hardwire that new movement pattern or skill into your unconscious mind. Now, I think we would all agree that, at least in Lamar's case, he learned a suboptimal skill. And so when he was faced with stress, he ended up getting shot in the foot. And the reason I wanted to begin with that story is I think it's a metaphor. I mean, who among us has one or two of these suboptimal patterns that come out when you're under stress and cause you to get shot in the foot? I've got a long list of them. So during the past decade in the neuroscience community, our understanding about what's actually happening inside Lamar's brain has exploded. The fundamental breakthrough that's allowed this to occur is that biological imaging technology has now progressed to the point where we can actually look inside your brain with such precision. We can actually see neural pathways while they're being built. We can see them dissolve. And with that, our ability to influence that is to rewire the brain at the cellular level, has similarly exploded. So during our time together, I'm going to invite you to join me on a journey into this cutting-edge science of rewiring your brain. Now, you may be wondering, why do you care? I mean, what difference does it make for you? You guys are business executives. And so you might wonder, well, this is cool, but how does it apply to me? And the answer is, you see, in the past 5 years, this science has progressed to the point where it's no longer a theoretical science. We now have the ability to actually go in and wire your brain differently such that your performance, so that your experience of life changes dramatically. And in fact, not only that, we are at the beginning of what is going to be a profound revolution in the business world, where fundamentally neuroscience and our ability to change our behavior with that science is going to fundamentally alter the way that knowledge workers, and that's people like you and me, how we operate. And I think many of you know this has already begun to infiltrate in the world of elite athletics. So it is said that in Rio, at the last Olympics, 80% of the athletes worked with neuroscience tools in order to improve their performance because it gave them a competitive edge. And so as you heard in the introduction, that same exact competitive edge is available to you today. So as we take our journey together, I want to make 3 stops along the way. First, I'd like to investigate with you the nature of the unconscious mind that we were talking about, and talk about why it's so incredibly critical, not only to everything we do, but as a foundation for rewiring science. And then second, I'm going to share with you some of the core breakthroughs that have occurred in this past decade in the neuroscience community, which allow us to actually go in and profoundly rewire our nervous system. And then third, we're going to take it home. And we're going to talk about the very practical ways you can apply this neuroscience today in order to profoundly improve not only your life experience, but your effectiveness. Does that sound good? Okay. Now, my knowledge about brain rewiring, it's not just from my capacity as a neuroscience. It's from my personal life as well. 14 years ago, before I had my business successes, I hit a low point in my life. In some ways, you could sort of say my life was a mess back then. I had just started my first company. It was a venture-backed company. It was going absolutely nowhere. I was working, I mean, literally 15, 16 hours a day, you know, drinking coffee by the gallon. And the company just wasn't going anywhere. And kind of to top that off, for the first time in my life back then, my body started to give out on me. So in addition to the fact that I was chronically exhausted, I weighed 20 pounds more back then than I do today. It wasn't muscle. And I really didn't know what to do. One morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. I look at my face, and I say to myself, David, you look like a ghost. I mean, really, my face was completely ashen. I just didn't know what to do. And in that moment, I said to myself, okay, David, and I'm sure many of you have had this moment like this too, enough, something needs to change. In that moment, that became the beginning of my own journey into rewiring my brain. Before I move on, let me actually tell you just a bit more about my earlier background, because it's very relevant to the rest of the story. I had an unusual childhood. I grew up in a family of scientists. So my father is the guy who invented bone marrow transplantation. My mother was a world-famous biochemist. No pressure, right? So the world I grew up in, the water I swam in, was the world of science and the scientific method. And then when I got older, I did what was expected of me, which is I went to Harvard College, I went to Harvard Medical School, and just like my father, I became a physician and a scientist. So now, fast forward to this point, 14 years ago, I'm standing in front of the bathroom mirror, saying something needs to change, not knowing what to do, and the strangest thought just kind of popped into my head. I said to myself, David, you're a scientist. What if you looked at this moment the way a scientist would? And as I said, that was the beginning of my journey, because you see, from that moment on, and really up until today, I started observing myself completely differently. I started observing myself objectively, kind of the way a scientist would look at a lab rat. And my first impulse was to start measuring things about myself. And so what I did is I started attaching electrodes to my body, and I put electrodes on my head, and I looked at my brain waves, and I looked at my heart patterns, and I looked at my respiration, and I looked at my posture, and I looked at my thoughts, and I looked at the temperature in my environment, and I measured anything I could. Now, what was I looking for? I was looking to see if there was something I could measure and quantify which correlated with, how much my life sucked, right? I was trying to find patterns. And as those patterns emerged, the next thing I did is I actually started to do experiments on myself to see, can I make the metrics, can I make these numbers move? Again, this is not a typical story, but it is mine. And as you might imagine, through this experimental process, I learned a lot of interesting things. I went down a whole lot of rabbit holes. But here's the bottom line. The man standing in front of you now is an unrecognizably different guy than the one you would have met 14 years ago. I'm not talking only about my hair. By virtue of testing my limits mentally and physically, I was able to fundamentally rewire who I am, how I show up in the world. And with that, my life really changed. And let me give you some examples. I changed myself physically. So there's something I think many of you have heard of that you can measure, which is called biological age. It's a measure of how old your body is, based not on your chronology, but on your blood chemistry. And what I can tell you is my biological age today is 4 years younger than it was 10 years ago when I started to measure it. I'm going to let you do the math yourself, but if you do your calculation correctly, you'll figure out that in 15 years, I'm going to be 8. I turned around my cognitive function, right, how I think as well. I actually increased my measured IQ by 7%, which is highly achievable for any of us, by the way. But more importantly, for the first time in my life, I found my way toward real joy. See, the bottom line is that the discovery I made for myself 14 years ago, the discovery that changed my life, was that you and I, we have these unconscious patterns, that is, patterns around which we have no conscious awareness, that shoot us in the foot. And when you identify and characterize and change those patterns, your life can profoundly improve without you having to work any harder. Now, this is a discussion with business executives, so let me tell you how this played out for me in the business arena. I took the company I was running, and in 9 months, after rewiring myself, I grew it from 7 million to 130 million in sales. I left that company. I started 2 others. Both of them rapidly grew to 100 million. One of them was the fastest growing company in the country. Now, I'm not telling you this to impress you. What I'm doing here is trying to impress upon you that when you rewire yourself, your life can change in extraordinary ways. Let me give you a quick example so that this can kind of make some tangible sense to you. It's a small example, but just watch this. I want to introduce you to the man you would have met 14 years ago based on how I stand. So 14 years ago, my posture, my breathing pattern were completely different. So in those days, just by habit, I had my shoulders hunched forward and I kept my chest concave. I had a completely different breathing pattern. At that point, my breathing was very shallow. It was in my neck. And I don't know if you noticed, but if you breathe shallowly and you put it in your neck, your voice sort of goes up a little higher and you start talking a little faster, and it's just sort of an automatic thing. And I don't know if you can imagine, but if I came up to you and I said, look, I've got a company and I'd like you to invest $1 million. Does this seem like the kind of man you would want to invest in? By comparison to someone where the only change is that I roll back my shoulders and I deepen my breath. And let me ask, does it really seem as if there's a different man standing in front of you now? Think about the impact of that alone in terms of my ability to raise capital or sell business. And so that's the type of thing in a very tangible way that I'm speaking about. And that brings us to the first stop in our journey together, and that is an investigation into the unconscious mind. So the unconscious mind, that's the part of your mind that decides to beat your heart 100,000 times every day. Right? Most of us are not consciously thinking about our heartbeat. I mean, who here has had the thought this morning, I think I better beat my heart now? You did. And looking at you, sir, I think that's a very good thought. But seriously, we couldn't function if we were thinking about that 100,000 times a day, but we need the heart to beat. So that's an example of a very deeply embedded unconscious process. And consider this. I mean, it's a little bit strange to say this, but in some ways, your nervous system actually makes a decision every time the heart beats, right? Because it'll decide to go faster or slower. Now, most of us, when we go around in the world, we operate as if it's our thinking mind, our conscious mind, which is governing our decisions and our actions. But in fact, the opposite is true. The vast majority of our decisions and actions, many of which have a huge impact on how our life shows up, operate way below the level of conscious awareness. In fact, when neuroscientists try to estimate it, when we try to say, how much of our life is conscious versus unconscious, we typically conclude that for every conscious decision or action we take, we've got 40,000 that are unconscious. So it's a hugely important and generally unrecognized part of our existence. Now, just to drive this notion into your conscious awareness, let me ask you a question. Where in your life do you see your unconscious mind at work? Say, where you find yourself doing something without any conscious awareness of what you're doing. Just shout it out. Give me an example. Driving. Oh, that's a great example. Right, especially here. So who here has ever had the experience where you get up in the morning, you get in your car, you start driving, 20 minutes later, you get out, you're at work, and you think back and you have absolutely no memory of those past 20 minutes? Just put your hand up if you can relate to that. I just want to ask you to think about this for a moment. You probably made hundreds of thousands of unconscious decisions during that 20-minute drive, right? I mean, you're pushing on the accelerator and the gas and turning the wheel. So it's a terrific example. And so the critical question to ask yourself at this point is, how do your unconscious patterns impact your life, either professionally or in general? And understand, most of the time the unconscious mind does its job really well, and we couldn't function without the unconscious mind. But there's two scenarios where the unconscious mind can cause you to shoot yourself in the foot. Let's just investigate those for a moment. The first one is something we're all familiar with, and that's where you've kind of got a tug of war between the conscious and the unconscious mind, right? Where they're pulling in opposite directions. And the best example of that is food, right? I mean, most of the time when I hear somebody starting a new diet, they utilize a strategy that I like to call the forever diet. And the strategy, it goes like this. They say, I'm going to take something that I really love to eat, like chocolate chip cookies, and then I'm going to eliminate it from my diet. And for how long? Forever. Right? Has anyone here ever tried that strategy? Right? And how did that work out for you? It doesn't work. But think about why that is. It's because you've got this kind of tug of war going between your conscious and your unconscious mind. You sort of can, it's like, imagine I'm the conscious mind over here. And I'm looking over here at a chocolate chip cookie and say, I shouldn't eat that chocolate chip cookie. It's not good for me. I'm going to eliminate that from my diet forever, right? And that's all well and good, except you see over here you have your unconscious mind, which is 40,000 times as big. And it's just saying, cookie. Right, so when you create a tug of war like that, the key message is you're taking on a tough battle. It is very difficult in situations like this to utilize willpower to overcome unconscious processes. And recognize everyone in this room has very strong willpower. But nonetheless, you're fighting a losing battle with this 1 to 40,000 ratio. Think for a moment about how this impacts you in your own life. In fact, turn to someone next to you just for 30 seconds and just share an example, particularly from your work arena, where you've got some sort of unconscious pattern that you keep vowing to overcome, and yet it keeps coming back and shooting you in the foot. Just turn to somebody and share that just for a few seconds while I drink water. Okay, thank you, partner, for sharing. And if you could turn your attention back to me. Thank you. Let me just share one or two examples. Could somebody share kind of an example from your own life of where you see this dynamic at play? Just anybody, could you just share? I just want to hear kind of what kind of things came out.
I have.
Yes, sir.
I was telling these guys I have a pet peeve about someone who's getting paid to speak and then makes us talk to each other while he's not.
Who here can relate to that? That's a deeply embedded unconscious pattern which just causes you to shoot the speaker in the foot. I completely understand that. Yeah, it's just so this is right. You always lose because the speaker is the one who gets the final word. I know it's a really rough situation. So I can really relate to that, and thank you for sharing. Yeah. I've heard that you guys are a tough crowd. I now know that it's actually true. There's actually a second way, though, where the unconscious mind really gets in the way, which is much more insidious and important. And this is the key thing I want to talk about. And that is where your unconscious patterns are things about which you don't have any awareness, and yet they're causing you to get shot in the foot. And this actually represents what rewiring science focuses on, unconscious patterns around which we're not conscious. Now, in fact, in the neuroscience literature, there are literally thousands of research studies which document this phenomenon, where people think they're one way while in fact unconsciously they're completely different. And I'll just give you one example to illustrate this. I think many of you have heard about the research going on in sleep, showing that if you're sleep deprived, it makes you less capable of fighting off disease, and it makes your cognition worse and your strength worse and so on. But there's another thing that comes out in this research which hasn't made its way into the popular media, which I think is even more interesting than the basic findings around sleep. And that is what's called the cognitive dissonance that exists between people's sense of how well slept they are and what the actual reality is. I'll tell you about my favorite study here. This particular study has now been done over 20 times. What you do is you take people and you get them really well rested. So you can establish a baseline, and then you measure things. And because it's been done many times, they've measured strength, they've measured reaction time, cognitive capability, and so on and so forth. So they get a baseline, and then they take those people and then they sleep deprive them. So you take this person, and then you say, okay, you're only allowed to sleep 4 hours. And then you wake them up before they're ready to wake up. And then you ask them, how do you feel? And they'll say, invariably, I feel like crap. And then you say, how do you think you're going to perform at this task, this cognitive task? And they will tell you, I don't think I'm going to do very well. I'm really exhausted. And you measure them, and sure enough, they're correct. Now then, you continue to sleep deprive them night after night after night, let's say for a week, 4 hours a night for a week. And then at the end of the week, you go back to them and you say, how do you feel? What do they say? They say, I feel great, Doug. Every time. And then you ask them, well, how do you think you're going to test? They say, I don't know, but I'm just feeling at the top of my game. I think I am absolutely at my best. And then you test them, and it turns out their performance has continued to decline profoundly. So you see, the bottom line message is you and I might be going to work every day thinking I am at the top of my game, while in fact, cognitively, you are nowhere close to that point. So as we dive into this world of rewiring science, that's the opportunity we are going to look after. Those places in which you have unconscious patterns that you don't have awareness of, which have a negative impact on your life experience and your ability to be effective. And with that, Let's now move to the second stop in our journey, and that is an investigation into the neuroscience of how you can actually rewire the brain, how you can rewire these unconscious patterns. Now, during this past decade, there's a fairly simple-sounding acronym which has evolved in terms of how you can rewire the brain, and it goes MIR. It stands for Measure, Interrupt, and Replace. Let me walk you through briefly the neuroscience, and then I'll talk you through some of the practical applications of this, because it's quite profound. Measure is something that I think is going to make intuitive sense to all of you. I mean, we all grew up on this notion that you manage what you measure, right? So why does that happen? It's because when you measure something, when you focus on it, you bring it into your conscious awareness. And it turns out that inside the brain, when you do that, when you activate the front part of your brain where you're conscious, it kind of loosens a neural pathway. And I mean that very literally. Like the pathway itself becomes less robust. Now that doesn't rewire it, but it sort of creates a foundation. The key breakthrough is the second step, which is the interrupt pattern. So it turns out if you take a neural pathway that is a connection of neurons where an unconscious habit is built, and you interrupt that pathway over and over, continuously and vigorously, for 30 days, that pathway will dissolve as if it had never been there. Now, I want you to think for just a moment about the implications of this scientific finding on behavior modification, on things like curing phobias, on curing addictions, and so on. We can take neural pathways that have been there for decades, and in 30 days, by interrupting them, make them dissolve. And the third step is you replace whatever the pattern is with something else which is associated with a reward, with a dopamine flush. And that completes the rewiring cycle. Now, I'll just tell you one example of where this is being used. This has absolutely no bearing on anyone in the room. I'm simply telling you it because it's really cool, just to illustrate the power of this, and then we'll talk about how you can actually practically use it. So, in addition to the fact that we're making IQs go up and now curing Alzheimer's disease and curing phobias, we've learned that we can take people who were born blind, who've never seen, and build neural pathways to give them sight. So if you take a person who's blind, and you take a digital camera and you feed information from the digital camera onto their tongue, and you make them function as if they can see, say, trying to pick up a glass of water, give them a reward. Over the course of 30 days, you will see the development of a new neural pathway from the tip of the tongue all the way through the brain to the very back to the visual cortex. And 30 days later, they will form three-dimensional color images. In other words, they will now be able to see. This is an FDA-approved capability. It's just staggering. Now, the thing is, this science, it doesn't need to be complex. You can use this in your everyday life. About 6 months ago, as my institute was starting to get traction, I was at a cocktail party in New York, and I had the very good fortune of meeting one of the world's most prominent billionaires. This is a guy everyone in this room has heard of. And he's fascinated by neuroscience. And so I got to talk to him, and we started to talk about this measure, interrupt, and replace paradigm. And he looked at me and he said, David, how can I use this to rewire myself so I can become more productive? Now, I was super excited because I was seeing like client here, right? And I wanted to bring him back to my lab, and I wanted to wire him up and measure his electrodes, and I was trying to get him back there, and he said, well, here's the thing, guys. I've got to leave to the airport in 10 minutes. You've got to give me something now, right? And I got some insight into how he became a billionaire. I was a little intimidated because I didn't have as much experience back then as I do now. But let me tell you what we came up with, because it turned out to work incredibly well. We set him up on a program for 2 weeks where once an hour while he was at work, his iPhone alarm would go off. And every time it went off, he was given 2 instructions. The first thing is he had to write down a number on a scale of 1 to 10 about how productive he thought he had been in that prior hour, just subjectively. And then he had to write down a couple sentences of notes about anything he noticed during the prior hour about his productivity. 3 days later, I get an email from the guy. And he says, David, I have been dazzled by the results of this experience. It turns out during those 3 days, there were 3 hours when he tried to write down notes, and he couldn't remember what had happened in the hour before. He had gotten lost in the internet or something. Now, keep in mind, this is not some schlub, right? This is one of the most productive human beings in the world, which is incredible. And 2 weeks later, he writes me again, and he says, I can't believe it, but I believe this process has, in fact, doubled my productivity. Now, why on earth would something that simple be so powerful? Well, would you agree, I mean, we didn't exactly do it in the right order. We did interrupt and measure and replace. But would you agree, if you have to write down a number on a scale of 1 to 10, you're forcing your conscious mind to actually measure, to look at whatever your behavior pattern is and make it conscious? Would you also agree, having the iPhone timer go off every hour, you're interrupting whatever's going on? So whatever unconscious pattern is there just gets interrupted over and over and over. Now, third, would you agree that the process of writing down notes about whatever you had noticed in the prior hour is actually going to engage your brain, so you're going to start continually changing in very small ways how you go about your productive day? And so this brings us to the third stop in our journey, which is an investigation into the practical ways in which you can apply this in your own life to enhance your effectiveness. But as you think about this transition, let me just ask you to do a quick exercise with me, if you could. So I'm going to ask you to sit up straight in your chair and put your feet flat on the floor just for a moment, okay? And when I say the word curl, what I want you to do is I want you to take your toes, and I want you to curl them in kind of as tight as you can for 30 seconds, okay? Is everybody ready? Curl. Now, who here has just stopped breathing? Okay, you can uncurl your toes now. Feel free to take a breath, please. But I wanted to show this to you because it's a reaction that's built into our nervous systems. When you tense up one part of your body, you're wired so that your entire body will tense up, and in fact, you stop breathing. Now, as you know, I mean, I come from the martial arts world, and I work with a lot of martial artists, and it's interesting. When you give that exercise to martial artists, they will curl their toes, and the rest of their body will relax, and they breathe deeply. Now, that may seem silly and minor, but let me ask, what impact would it make if when you faced stress, your body naturally and automatically relaxed and you breathed deeply? How would that impact you in your day-to-day world? Do you think it would have an impact? Yeah. Well, that brings us, as I said, to the third stop on our journey, and actually that's where I would like to focus. If you excuse me for a second, I just want to see where I'm doing on time, because I know I have to get you out of here in 20 minutes. So I'm going to focus on this one topic of the stress reaction. Now, you know, in our world, we look for levers. We look for what are the things, the unconscious patterns we could change where we're going to have an impact, you know, where a golfer can have fewer strokes to win a game, or a basketball player can, you know, sink a basket more frequently, you know, or an executive can be more productive. It turns out, in our world, that stress reaction has a very profound impact unconsciously on executive performance. In fact, if you can master your stress reaction, your productivity will increase. Now, this is a bit of a sort of surprise discovery. You know, first of all, let me go over why this matters. You all know what a stress reaction is. I mean, we all, you know, you live in a world of stress. So all of us have a lot of stress in our life. And what it is biologically is it's a hardwired reaction that we all have that's tens of thousands of years old, right? It's the fight or flight response. And so tens of thousands of years ago, if a bear was attacking you in the woods, your amygdala in your brain would sense a threat, you would feel fear, you would send a message to your adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands release a whole bunch of chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol to put you into this fight or flight state, which means that your body is positioned to fight or flee. And it's a very useful reaction if you happen to be in the woods being attacked by a bear. What we've learned, though, is it's not quite so useful in a business setting. Now, let me tell you why. The interesting insight is what happens to your brain when the fight or flight reaction takes over is that the blood flow in your brain changes to be adaptive to run away from a bear. Now, forgive me, there's a lot of science in the next minute, but trust me, it's worth it. So I think many of you know there are 3 levels in the brain, right? There's the reptilian brain, which is closest to the spinal cord, first to evolve, and that's where the heartbeat and the breathing and stuff comes in, right? That's our most basic functions. Then there's the limbic system, which we share with most mammals, and that's where you have emotions and so on. But they're only the simple emotions, things like fear and anger. And then there's the neocortex, which is unique to humans and dolphins a little bit, which is where we think. So it turns out that when the body says, I want to fight or flee, it directs blood flow to your muscles so that you have strength and so you can run. Now, where does it take it away? It takes it away from the neocortex. In other words, in the stress reaction, unconsciously, it turns out you lose the capacity to think, and you react impulsively based on fear and anger. Again, if a bear is attacking you, you don't want to think about the implications of the bear and their family and how the bear has feelings as well. But consider this. Now, how did we figure this out? Well, it turns out we study athletes. My favorite study is with hedge fund traders. So I work with some hedge fund traders, and it turns out you can predict whether a trade is going to be profitable. These are people who are making $7-10 million bets, like every 10 minutes or so. By measuring the cortisol level in their blood, you can tell in advance whether they're going to make a profitable trade or not. It turns out cortisol levels are highly predictive of whether a trade is going to be profitable or not, and the trader has no awareness beforehand. That same thing is true in golfers. That same thing is true in the military and snipers. Right? The first study was actually done in snipers by my chief science officer at the Platypus Institute, and she showed that when you look at snipers, if their body has a stress reaction, they will miss the target, and if they are in the sort of the zone, they won't. But the snipers weren't aware of when they were in one state or the other. Because you see, the stress reaction is something we're really not conscious of most of the time. It's subtle. And the bizarre thing about a stress reaction is it feels good to you, because you've got this massive burst of energy from adrenaline. So what happens is you feel very emotional, you feel very driven, but it turns out you're going to make horrible decisions, and while you'll go really quickly, your ability to be effective is very limited. So I can tell you, I can take 2 strokes off of any elite golfer's game simply by managing the stress reaction. I can double the productivity of pretty much any business executive simply from pushing this one lever. And so that's the one I wanted to share with you. We've got probably a dozen of these types of levers, but this is my favorite. So how do you use this in a practical way? You need to measure, interrupt, and replace your stress. So let me just give you some thoughts about this. And you can do this in 30 days. So the Mayo Clinic has now got 1,500 people they've pushed through a system. You can reduce your stress levels by about 70% in 30 days from doing what I'm about to tell you in the next 3 minutes. And not only that, it'll make your productivity go up, you're going to be happier, and so on. Measure means you have to become aware of your stress reaction. It's not something most of us are aware of, but once you start paying attention, it is impossible to miss because it's such a profound reaction. What happens? The adrenaline causes your blood pressure to go up, it causes your heartbeat to go faster, your skin will get flushed, and the experience will be of having a lot of energy and contraction. I mean, think about the feeling of fear. Would you call fear something which is contracted or expanded? What do you think? It's contracted, right. So if you are feeling that sense of contraction, that's a word that people universally use. So just notice your skin flushing. If you notice a stress reaction, here's the message to remember. it's not serving you. Your brain has now moved to the level of someone who's got the intelligence level of a cat. I'm just telling you. So you notice it and then you interrupt it. Now, how do you interrupt it is fascinating. Turns out that to interrupt a stress reaction, what you do is you have to activate the parts of your brain that are turned off and vice versa. And the mindset to take on is one of curiosity. This was invented by a friend of mine named Judson Brewer at Yale, and it's tripled our effectiveness in treating addiction, just learning this one thing. So if you try to deal with stress by breathing or meditating or something, you won't do it because you're using willpower to try to overcome the stress reaction. Has anyone ever seen a 5-year-old kid in the middle of a temper tantrum when you say to them, hey, look over there, and the temper tantrum stops? Has anyone ever seen that? Is what happens is you enter a new mind state and the stress reaction gets interrupted. So if you become curious about what's happening, you say, hey, I wonder what's going on. It's curious, I noticed tightness in my chest. I wonder what it is that's triggering me to freak out like this. The process of doing that will actually interrupt it, and you can stop pretty much any stress reaction in about 90 seconds. And then you enter a state of openness. You breathe, you give yourself a dopamine shot, you give yourself a reward. You do that over and over for 30 days. And you measure the level of stress in your body, it will go down by 50%. It's really miraculous. So that's the practical tool I want to leave you with. One more thing, and then I want to open this up for questions. I had said to you that the neuroscience world is going to promote a revolution in the world of business and, in fact, the world. And there's no question that's going to happen. And you may be saying, well, you know, the stuff you're talking about, that sounds cool, but that's not going to create a revolution. So I'd like to just take 2 minutes and investigate where not only my institute, but where the science is moving. Now let me ask you this. Have you ever had a moment, maybe it's just a couple seconds, maybe a couple minutes, maybe a couple hours, where sort of suddenly and unexpectedly you enter this state of bliss, but at the same time you're wildly productive. You can sort of see around corners and everything just flows. Who here can relate to that? What turns out, McKinsey did a study on this and they showed that executive productivity increases 5-fold if you're in that state. And that's the state associated with creativity, with insight. So let me ask you this question. What if we could take a snapshot of what's going on in your brain and body when you're in that state and then train you so that you've got access to that state at will? What's happening in the world of neuroscience in terms of where the research breakthroughs are is we are working at the level of teams and individuals to find that state, to find that flow state, that place where you're in the zone, understanding the brainwave pattern, training people to get into that. And I will tell you, with that type of technology, the creative output of creative teams, the power of athletic performance is getting to levels that we were never able to conceive of. You know, historically, when we have sought to improve human performance, we've relied on platitudes. We've relied on motivational thinking. We've relied on motivational speaking. You know, we've relied on kind of moving our cheese. And I assert to you, in a world today, you know, where the competitors we face are the likes of Uber or Google, or maybe your company, you want to be the next Uber or Google, that's just not going to cut it anymore. What's required to function in the evolving world today is a quantum shift inside your brain and that of your workforce. So the promise of neuroscience, what I and my colleagues are working toward, is to fundamentally decode what you and I are capable of being at our best, and then to use that science to induce the ability to be there at will. That's what the Platypus Institute is dedicated to. That's my hope for each and every one of you. So before I close, I think I've got about 5 minutes for Q&A, and then I just have a couple posing questions. Yes, sir.
Have you possibly written a book about this?
I'm actually starting to write a book about the stress reaction. It's fascinating, but I don't have a book yet. I don't have a TED Talk. I don't have a book. But yes.
So it seems like there's a tremendous problem out there with addiction. You know,
Yes.
Are you able to use your strategies and techniques to help those people in need of that?
So the answer to the question is a two-part answer. The world of neuroscience is making immense progress in that arena. So our ability to cure addiction at this point is around 2.5 times what it was. Like our cure rates are about 2.5 times as great as they were 10 years ago, and it's moving very rapidly. Addiction's a little bit hard because you're playing with chemistry as well as neuroscience. I mean, as well as the kind of the wiring of the brain. But with that said, I don't play in that world. I play with athletes and executives and so on. So that's a whole different group. But yeah, there's well over 1,000 neuroscientists who are spending all of their time thinking about addiction, and incredible progress is being made there. There's one other thing I'll just share with you. There's a whole lot of neuroscientists employed by the people who try to addict you as well, right? So, the dating apps and Candy Crush, I mean, they've got teams of neuroscientists who are focusing their question on what can I do to addict people to this. And so if you think of like on Candy Crush, how you get this big reward every time you win something, it's because it's creating a dopamine rush and it's actually building a neural pathway. It's building addiction. So it's kind of, whatever, that's the world of science. Yes, sir?
You haven't written a book, it seems like you're slacking a little bit.
I am slacking. I thank you for that. I'm sort of embarrassed. I think I need to rewire myself.
Come on.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do about that. Thank you.
One good sports story, maybe the elite athletes, that you work with and learn from.
Well, okay, I'll give you a good sports story. Because I got to train some athletes, because one of the groups we work with is Red Bull. So here's
I'm a coach, that's why I ask.
So Red Bull does this thing they call performance under pressure. I'm just telling you the story. So they brought in a number of the athletes who were going to go to Rio and put them through this performance under pressure training program. Right, and the question was, can you freak these guys out? Can you induce a stress reaction? Now, these guys are pretty hard to freak out. So what they did is they did two things. They made them crawl through a pit of snakes. So they took these athletes, they put a blindfold on them, they had a pit like this big, and then they had to crawl from here to there while blindfolded, and then I had a whole bunch of sensors on them. Now, the average athlete's pulse rate is way lower than yours and mine, right? So they were like 40 when they started. Of the athletes who went through, the lowest heart rate on this very slow climb through the snakes, the lowest one at the end was 140, right? So then they take the athletes out from the snake pit. We all sit outside just to sort of regroup, and they're sort of kind of calming down, and a trained bear comes and attacks the group, right? Now, why do I share that? Because they were getting letters from these athletes in Rio saying, I was standing on the diving board, I was waiting at the starting gate, and I remembered the snakes, and I said, if I could make it through that, I could make it through this. And we had a number of gold medalists. So that's my sports story about this is kind of the world it's all about performance under pressure. It's all about the stress reaction. We just have to play at a league. The nice thing is with business executives, it's not that hard to induce a stress reaction. But with these athletes, you got to work. You got to work for your money.
Snakes, I'll get the bear, and I'll meet your friend.
Oh my God, it was wild, the snake thing. And the guy at Red Bull who does this is this guy Andy Walsh, who's like this Australian guy who grew up around snakes, and he just said, I don't understand why anyone's scared of them. But turns out probably wouldn't work in Australia.